But one can argue on 3 points. 1. Jesus' disciples were baptizing in water while Jesus was still with them. 2. Jesus himself was baptized in water by John. And lastly, 3. Jesus commissioned the 12 disciples to baptize in natural water for their own missions. Now, these 3 points, many will say, could prove all of my theories to be completely wrong. So, let's speak about them, of which topics will actually last through several chapters herein, for there's much to say. Firstly, while it is true that Jesus' disciples were baptizing in water, and even continued to do so after Jesus' ascension, the Bible specifically says that Jesus never did so himself, which is very important for us to understand. The Gospel of John, chapter 4, verse 2. Though Jesus himself baptized not, but his disciples, which, as I've said, water baptism is not his specific baptism. Therefore, and even though his own disciples did so themselves throughout their own ministry, it eventually, as once more, we're going to see in a moment, faded away as to being associated with Jesus' name. And if that's true, then connecting water baptism with Jesus' name today cannot be a biblical exercise. As Paul actually stressed in 1 Corinthians 1, verse 15, that if he were to continue the practice of it himself, as well as delegating it to his own disciples, then the act would automatically attach itself to his own name. But even so, let's continue to speak on the other points that I had brought up. But before continuing with the disciples' own practicing of that act after the day of Pentecost, let's first talk about Jesus having John baptize him in natural water. But believe it or not, the reason for that is rather simple. And neither does this reason prove that it's a surefire sign that we have to do so in our own modern times. Jesus, believe it or not, was actually baptized during the Old Testament and not during the New Testament. Despite our modern Bible declaring just before the book of Matthew that we're about to read the New Testament did not actually commence, or that is, officially commence, until after Jesus had died on the cross, and then after that, it commenced for the rest of us on the day of Pentecost. We go to Hebrews chapter 9, verses 16 and 17. For where a testament is, there must also of necessity be the death of a testator. For a testament is of force after men are dead. Otherwise, it's no strength at all while the testator still lives. Also, in another place, Paul confirms the Old Testament existence of Jesus while on earth. In Galatians 4, verse 4. But when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son to earth for an earthen ministry, made of a woman, made under the law. That is, made under the Old Testament Mosaic law. So saying, the New Testament did not officially begin until after he died on the cross. Therefore, Jesus was baptized into natural water, not during the New Testament, but during the Old. So, does that really make a difference? I actually think that it makes a huge difference. Jesus came to close out the Old Testament, of which commission he passed on to his 12 disciples in Jerusalem to continue to do. So the only way that he could close it out was to fulfill the old law, along with all of its ritualistic, fleshly ordinances, else they would truly still stand today. Matthew 5, verse 17. This is Jesus speaking. Think not that I come to destroy the law, the old law, or the prophets. I'm not come to destroy, but to fulfill. That means to close it out, complete it, accomplish it. Matthew chapter 3, verses 14 through 15 says, But John forbid him, saying, Well, I've got need to be baptized of you. That is, in spirit, and not natural water. Whereas we already saw, John himself declared that Jesus' baptism was by spirit and fire. And you come to me, i.e., for a natural baptism? Jesus answering said unto him, Suffer it to be so now, i.e., until the end of the Old Testament, i.e., until heaven and earth passes. which passing I'm going to be speaking on in the very next chapter. For thus it becomes us, that is, now, before the New Testament fully comes into existence, to fulfill, that is, to complete, all Old Testament righteousness, so that the Old Testament can come to an end. Then he suffered him. John baptized him into natural water so that Jesus could fulfill the old law in his own life, and by performing that ritual to begin his closing out process for the rest of us. And then we see Jesus say that it's all over with when he died on the cross. John 19, verse 30. Jesus therefore received the vinegar. He said, "It's finished." And he bowed his head and he gave up the ghost. The ordinances, which were all nailed to his cross, as we're fixing to see in the scriptures, were any and all fleshly rituals that were performed during the Old Testament by and with the members of the outward man body, as is so expressed by Paul here in Ephesians 2, verse 15. Having abolished in his flesh, when Jesus died on the cross, the enmity, that is, an enemy, even which were the law of commandments contained in ordinances, for to make in himself twain one new man, so making peace. Not the law itself, which is certainly one of the dictionary definitions for ordinance, which I got an explanatory note on that in just a minute. But we're speaking of the law that was contained in ordinances, that is, which were mixed in with the old law, a contaminant that needed expulsion, where it became the enmity of Jesus' new gospel. But before I finish this chapter, let me read, which is certainly one of the dictionary definitions for ordinance. Now, what I'm about to expound upon in this explanatory note for ordinances is a very important direction that this book now needs to take. And beginning to do so here at the end of chapter 1 is a very good starting point for it. And as we're going to see, the learning of biblical ordinances is not only important for this current subject and topic, but it'll help us to understand water baptism and the communion in a more focused, revealing light. Now, what's confusing for a lot of people, though, is the word ordinances itself, especially in its connection with water baptism and the communion. For in our dictionary meaning, which we're fixing to read, we can see that the main definition is simply a law. But that's not where the buck stops. In its continued entries, it actually gives us 3 different definitions of what kind of law that really is: civil, ceremonial, and ecclesiastical. Now, ordinances, which is dogma, and as is used in Ephesians 2:15a, and from Strong's Greek Dictionary, says that it's a law, civil, ceremonial, and ecclesiastical, a decree, an ordinance. And according to Webster's Dictionary, a civil law, in a general sense, is a law of a state, city, or country. An ecclesiastical law is an assembly or meeting pertaining or relating to the church, as ecclesiastical discipline or government, ecclesiastical affairs. But a ceremonial law, it relates to ceremony or external rite, a ritual, according to the forms of established rites, as ceremonial exactness. It is particularly applied to the forms and rites of the Jewish religion, as the ceremonial law or worship, as distinguished from the moral or judicial law. And ceremonial, in continuing Webster's definitions, is an outward form, an external rite, or established forms or rites, including all the forms prescribed, a system of rules and ceremonies enjoined by law or established by custom, whether in religious worship, in social intercourse, or in the courts of princes. Now, in Ephesians 2:15, we can see plainly that Paul was not referring to the law of Moses itself with his comments, but to the law as it was contained or wrapped up tight in the ordinances, that is, the rituals themselves, and of which ceremonies, he continued to say, had become God's enemy. Did he say that? Let's see it again. Ephesians 2:15a. Having abolished in his flesh, when he died on the cross, the enmity, even which were the law of commandments contained in ordinances. What's an enmity? According to Strong's Greek dictionary, it's hostility. By implication, a reason for opposition, enmity or hatred. It became an enemy to God. But why? Yes, we must ask why, especially since it was God himself who had established such rituals in the Old Testament. In Exodus 18, verse 20, it says, "You shall teach them ordinances and laws," showing a separation here of both the civil law and the ceremonial ritual part of that law, "and you shall show them the way wherein they must walk, and the work," again the rituals, "that they must do." But after a while of their usage, or rather of their misusage, Isaiah shows us how that God began to get sick and tired of those rituals by his own day and time. In Isaiah 1, verses 11 through 15, "To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices unto me, says the Lord? I'm full of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts. I delight not in the blood of bullocks or of lambs or of he-goats. When you come to appear before me, who's required this at your hand to tread my courts? Bring no more vain oblations. Incense is an abomination unto me. The new moons and your Sabbaths, the calling of assemblies, I cannot away with. It's iniquity. Even your solemn meeting, your new moons and your appointed feasts, my soul hates. They're trouble unto me. I'm weary to bear them. And when you spread forth your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Yea, when you make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood." Again, why? It was how the people were doing and performing them. Their hearts still remain unclean. They were going through the motions without them even meaning anything anymore. And instead of understanding that a sacrifice actually meant giving up something that you love in this world to gain God, their understanding of a sacrifice was just to bring an animal and kill it every time they did something wrong. And by doing so, they gained no understanding. So the entire thing simply became God's enemy. In fact, we see Jesus' rage when dealing with those wretches in the temple. Can we imagine what he saw? And just for illustration, I'm going to give a ridiculous image for the reader to consider. But surely it went along the lines of this: "Get your doves and your lambs for sacrifice in here. 2 doves for $1 and your sins will vanish. Step right up, folks." In John 2, verses 13 through 16, we read, "And the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and he found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the changers of money sitting. And when he made a scourge of small cords, he drove them out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overthrew the tables. And he said unto them that sold the doves, Take these things hence. Make not my Father's house a house of merchandise." It therefore became such a hassle to the user and potential Christian that it was Paul himself who had ended up calling all such labors the enemy of God. As for these ordinances and of what they all entail, and even if we can today imply that we may still be guilty of doing any, I'm going to certainly get into that discussion during the course of this book. For, and as I have already said earlier, I am just beginning this journey with chapter 1 here, and I'm going to get into extreme details as we continue on. Now, and as to the finishing of this book, let's read Colossians 2:14. "Blotting out the handwriting of ordinances," i.e. written down in the Old Testament, "that was against us, an enmity, an enemy, which was contrary to us. And he took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross." But now, and before continuing with Paul's decision to pass up the water baptism, let's briefly cover the heaven and earth passing away, a 2,000 years ago event. So we can definitely see how all the fleshly, naturalistic, ritualistic ordinances have totally vanished. And that's the end of chapter 1. Thanks for listening.